All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining the Rules and Legislative Oversight Committee. We will be hearing Bill number CC 21-0036, Ordinance City Code Definitions, Rules of Interpretation. I'd like to welcome the bill sponsor, Councilman Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And members of the committee, Councilman Conway, Councilwoman McCray. We have Mr. DeFranco from Legislative Reference. We have Mr. Turvila from Law, Ms. Thimilis from the Mayor's Office, Ms. Thompson from the Council President's Office. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to the bill sponsor to explain what this bill is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate you calling the hearing for this bill today. I was just looking at your attendee list. It looks like you have another committee member in the attendees, Councilman Burnett, waiting to be elevated, which would make a quorum here. That'd be great. Look, nobody could better explain the need and simplicity of this bill than Tony and DLR. This is a very straightforward and I would say overdue, simple administrative bill. The city's code simply lacks a centralized place in which certain definitions and rules of interpretation lie. And this ends up necessitating certain terms and rules of interpretation being stated and restated and defined again and again and again, kind of ad nauseum, instead of simply having them in one centralized place, like every other jurisdiction, every other major jurisdiction in Maryland has, like the state of Maryland has, and after which we have modeled this bill. It's worth noting that the section of code, if for nerds like me, if you go and you read the city code on at least a daily basis, like I do, you'll note that the page where DLR houses the code online has two separate sections, one noted as the unrevised code, and which is where we find most of what we would reference on a day-to-day basis, and then others, the revised code, which houses the health code and the building code, which are formatted differently than the unrevised code. And at the end of last term, with the creation of the Administrative Procedure Act, a new article was added into this revised code, where eventually the aspiration is to house all of the city's code in a newly reformatted manner. One day when DLR has had the time to go through all this, and we've been able to take the necessary legislative action to make that happen. The Administrative Procedure Act, which, like this bill before the committee today, was a long overdue administrative bill and a long overdue way of bringing the city in correlation with what every other major jurisdiction in the state of Maryland does, what most jurisdictions throughout the country do, what every state in the union do. This created this new section of revised code in which the Administrative Procedure Act was placed, and where this new section on definitions and rules of interpretation will go, and include, simple terms such as may and shall and must, and in fact defining code. And so these are, just a handful of really commonly used terms throughout ordinances. And I ask for a favorable report on the bill today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I see we've been joined by Councilwoman Ramos, Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I think that's it. All right, I'll just go in order. I see under agency reports, there's no report here for the law department. Mr. Turvila.
I'm sorry. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. This is Vic Turvola for the City Law Department. We did file a report. I'm surprised you don't have it in front of you, but the report says basically we think this is a great idea and there are no legal impediments to the passage of this bill.
Okay, thank you. The next one up, Department of Finance.
Good afternoon, Mara James for the Department of Finance. We stand by our report. We do not oppose this legislation.
Okay, and now last and most importantly in this, legislative reference.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tony DeFranco on behalf of the Department of Legislative Reference. We stand by our report. We very much support this bill, and we are excited about the prospects of joining our sister jurisdictions in having a centralized definitions and rules of interpretation portion of our code.
Excellent. Well, if you support it, I support it. So does anybody have any questions? Councilman Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one, and you guys listed a number of definitions in the bill. Will any of those definitions have any impact on anything previously? I guess the code as it stands.
I'm happy to answer that question if Councilman Dorsey. So at first, it will not. The long-term plan, short-term, medium-term, is to at some point have one of our regularly scheduled corrective bills that would go through the code and take out those references that are purely duplicative. Otherwise, and I'm thinking of the word person, sometimes we add an extra prong to the definition of person to include the government. At the standard definition does not include that. So if there is some sort of deviation, we would keep that portion of it, but get rid of everything that is purely duplicative.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Councilman, for bringing this to us and thinking it through. I had a question either to the sponsor or to Mr. DeFranco. You mentioned that the only question I had was person definition. And because it talks about a person may be an individual or a receiver, trustee, et cetera, et cetera. I thought that we normally we're usually very prescriptive and descriptive in our legislation around what an individual means. And so can you go through why we have to have a standard definition like this? And then similarly, when we see definitions or when we see bills in the future where it says person, it could mean any of these things, and how confusing that might be in the legislation.
I think that, again, this is a good one for Tony to answer, or perhaps Victor. Is it the case that this is one of the kind of definitions that is more or less derived from state law?
That's correct. And the distinction between person and individual, an individual means a human being. Person can encapsulate anything that the state has recognized as having some sort of legal rights, a business organization. You would want to preserve that definition of person, for instance, to when you have some sort of application process and you don't know if the application process might be limited to an individual or a corporation or some sort of other business organization. So this word person sort of encapsulates all of that.
Mr. Chair, can I add a follow-up, please?
Sure.
But in our, I guess the question is moving forward when we see the word person, and yet it means all of these different things, don't we still have to have some clarity that, you know, a piece of legislation that that is for business entities needs to be very specific that that's what it's for. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where the application of this would come from so that we're not confusing the issue of who we're talking about when we say person.
Well, to be clear, we need, when we draft legislation, we tailor it to whatever the sponsor is looking for. If a particular ordinance only might affect individuals, we would use the word individual. But if we don't know from the onset who it might affect, person is probably the more appropriate term.
And may I add, this is Victor Hurley from the Law Department. May I add, every time, in my experience, every time that we've used the word person in the code, it's been defined, and it's been defined either to, as we have it in this bill, or it's defined to include government as well. So we've been very careful in our code when we use the term person, what we mean. And essentially what Tony is pointing out and what's in this bill is what we typically have. Usually we're very careful about when we bring the government into being a person, because then we're liable for certain acts. And this is something that when we look at state legislation and they talk about person, when I look at it, I'm very careful about, is it bringing in the city of Baltimore under these laws? And it's the same sort of situation that we go through. In my experience, legislative reference has been very careful when they use that term.
I'm still confused, Mr. Chair.
I think the simplest way for me to think of this is basically that as a matter of habit, the way that person is being defined in this bill is the way person is commonly defined. And there are two basic derivations from that can and occasionally do occur. One is to be more inclusive, which would require the, as was just stated, to expand the scope of a specific piece of legislation to also include government. And one would be to be more narrowly tailored to be more exclusive, in which case the term person would not be used. And instead, if we were referring to a business entity, we would say a business, or if we were referring to an individual, we would say individual, or for example, in certain cases, you might say an individual or family, but person is in the way that it is defined here is in very common usage legislatively, and so we understand that through these kind of same rules, we can become more exclusive or more inclusive as the case may necessitate.
So then why do we need to have it here if we have to define it every time we're talking about it in other legislation? I'm just curious.
Because we don't have to define it in every other case if we define it here. It's only, it is most commonly used in exactly this way. And by placing it here, instead of having to restate it again and again and again in every other piece of legislation, the only time that you would need to use something other than this is when you need to be more inclusive or more exclusive, as the case may be for a specific bill. But this is the most common general usage in applicability of bills.
I guess if someone can give me an example of, how we're going to use this particular definition moving forward so that it's not, confusing, and make sure that we have, the way that it's going to be applied. But also if I could get an example of when it was called person, when all these other things should have been included in it. That's all. I really appreciate that we're doing this because it just makes everybody's life a lot easier. I just had a question about that particular piece.
If you go through most of our code right now, especially, and I brought this up earlier, especially when you're talking about a licensure scheme. For instance, something that's very popular, towing. At the onset of somebody coming to apply for their towing license in Baltimore City, we don't know if that individual is going to be an individual or if they're going to be applying as their corporate entity. So we need a term that encapsulates both, that sort of anticipates both possibilities, that somebody could apply for a towing license as an individual, but they could also apply as their LLC, as the case may be. So the flip side of that would be some sort of ordinance regulating how people use the sidewalk. Of course, you're not going to have an LLC riding their bike down the sidewalk, but you might have a human being, and there we might have use the word no individual may ride their bike on the sidewalk. Not
So
very
let
good. Not a very
Tony
good
used the exact example that I was going to give. At the time when I introduced this bill, I went to social media and made a note that in looking through Article 15 of the City Code, the licensing and regulation article, I found the word person defined more than a dozen times in that article in the exact same way every time. And I think in like no instance did I find any derivation of need where we were, including a governmental entity or only applying to, other, more narrow definitions. So, I mean, person just again and again and again, particularly in that article, you can go through that and find more than a dozen instances.
can I give you I'm looking at one of them. This is in the adult entertainment business. This is Article 15, Subtitle 1, Adult Entertainment Business. And person is defined here, and you can match it up to the person definition that you see. Person, 1, in general. Person means an individual. 2, a receiver, trustee, guardian, personal representative, fiduciary, or representative of any kind. Or 3, a partnership, firm, association, corporation, or other entity of any kind. And then if we go to subparagraph 2, it says exclusions. Persons does not include, unless otherwise expressly provided, a governmental entity or an instrumentality or a unit of a governmental entity. So you see, that's pretty much what we're trying to do. Ultimately, we're just trying to save ink. I mean, from my world, we're just trying to save ink. We don't have to keep on repeating this time after time after time. We can just use person, and if it's something else, if it means something else other than that definition, then we're going to be using an individual or a corporation or whatever particular specific term would define what we're really focused on.
So then would you, if you're using this definition of person, then reference this part of the article, or it would just be assumed that it's person unless there's a specific definition that we're trying to get to?
Right. The way it works is that once it's in the general provisions article, then that means that anytime you see the word person, if you don't know, if it's not defined in that particular statute, you go back to the general provisions article, you'd look up person and what is basically what you see here and say, it means that. But if you all say, well, no, we really mean a corporation here. We don't mean an individual. You'll see corporation as opposed to person.
Okay, so it's more of a way to, because I guess if I'm understanding this correctly, usually when we're doing legislation, it applies to the whole, right? As a person is the whole of whatever type of entity other than government in this particular case, right? And then if person means something different, so like another example, I'll just use tax sale because I'm working on that right now. If I want the article or the bill to apply to individuals who are homeowners, then I would be very specific that person means that and not, the LLC or whatever. Is that how we're trying to do this?
That's exactly right. And so when you go to legislative reference, you're going to be telling them that's what you want, and they're going to put that in the bill, and they're not going to be using that term.
Okay, I really appreciate you thinking this through with me. I really appreciate it, and I'm clear now. Thank you.
If I could, just one last note, Mr. Chair, that it occurs to me to just make clear that placing these definitions in a general provision section so that they can be relied on without the need for any successive reference to them is a fundamental shift in how our local articles are organized. And Tony can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but basically it changes the hierarchy entirely of how we define and how our code is structured, kind of from a top-down perspective instead of a bottom-up, whereas right now, any term needs to be defined in the smallest subsection of code in which the term is used. So if it's used in multiple subsections at kind of like a particular level of a code, you know, if you look at the way a piece of code is outlined, if it's used in multiple subsections of a fairly low-lying level, then it also, then instead of being defined in that lowest level, it gets defined in the highest level under which each of those subsections would fall in an outline. And what this does is basically says, no, the things that are the most common can go up to the highest level and don't have to be redefined at any lower level ever. Did I get that pretty much right, Tony?
Perfect. As if stated by Avery Eisenstark himself.
Yes! I'm channeling my inner Avery.
All right, any other questions? If there are no other questions, we've been joined by Councilman Costello and Council Vice President Middleton. I will entertain a motion if anyone has one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Like to move the bill, Mr. Chair?
Okay, moved by Burnett. Do we have a second? Second by Conway. Can we do a roll call vote?
Okay. Ready for roll call, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Okay. Chair Schleifer?
Yes.
Chair Schleifer votes aye. Mr. Burnett?
Yes.
Mr. Burnett votes aye. Mr. Conway?
Aye.
Mr. Conway votes aye. Mr. Costello?
Aye.
Mr. Costello votes aye. Vice President Middleton?
Aye.
Fine. Glad we finally got you.
Yes, I've been having problems all day. Thank you for
Okay.
helping me out there, Richard.
That's why I went looking for you. Member Ramos?
Yes.
Member Ramos votes aye. Mr. Chair, Member Torrance doesn't appear to be online, but we can record the vote now, but we can also keep it open in case he joins us later. Right now, there's 6 votes in the affirmative, no negatives, and we can go to second reading at the next meeting.
Okay, excellent. And we will take a 5-minute break before we move on to the next hearing, which will start at 2:30.
Mr. Chair, I actually have Councilman Torrance on the line.
Okay.
Hey, we're voting on Dorsey's bill about the code provisions. Are you coming? Yep.
Put them on speakerphone.
1 second.
You're on mute.
Okay, he's off.
Councilman Torrance? Hey, Councilman, we're taking a vote on Councilman Dorsey's legislation. Do you want to vote over speakerphone?
Yes, that's fine.
You're a yes vote on that, Councilman?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Did you hear that, Mr. Chairman?
I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Do we
Okay.
authenticate that that's his voice and not somebody else that Councilman Costello brought in to vote? I'm joking with you.
Okay.
Good. We're good. We'll take a break until
Hey, we'll
2:30.
vote on it